right, you ready for Africa? Let's do this. All right, Act 4, Modern Africa, and this time we're talking about HIV. So when we last left Africa, we were talking about the slave trade, right? And generally, when people talk about the slave trade in the United States, they tend to leave out the Africa side, right? So we talked a lot about the impact of slavery in the Americas, but let's talk about what happened in Africa. So from 1500 to 1900, the rest of the world's population was growing rapidly. Africa's did not. It was either stagnant or declined. That is a huge historical anomaly. I think it's important to remember that when people want to talk about Africa's population and Africa's population rates now. In a lot of ways, it's just a rebound, okay? So Africa is actually artificially underpopulated because so many people were taken out for the slave trade from West Africa, particularly. The majority of the people taken were men, and so you've got to think about this. For hundreds of years in parts of West Africa, people were in constant threat of being kidnapped and human trafficked. It was a very common thing, and most likely they were going to take your young men. And so you have a whole society that grows up in a constant kind of state of crisis, right? And women have to take on a lot of roles that maybe they otherwise wouldn't have. And because slavery did benefit some people in Africa, it benefited the elites, it benefited the powerful, the wealthy, if they were able to work with the Europeans instead of have the Europeans exploit them and destroy them. So you do end up with growing inequality within African societies as well, where you have basically the people profiting off of slavery at the top and the people at risk of being enslaved at the bottom. And you had the introduction of European firearms, which of course, kind of as we talked about before in the Congo, just gas on fire, right? All of these conflicts that already existed, all of these tensions, now it's a gunfight, and so it can get a lot worse. So by the time you kind of had abolition of slavery in the Americas, Europe had changed their position where they weren't looking towards the Americas, they were looking towards Africa, India, points east. So by this time, about, let's say 1860, Africa had been really transformed by the slave trade. So especially West Africa. So you had a lot of African leaders who were dependent on Europe for military support. We kind of talked about how that worked with the Congo, where eventually you had the support of one European country because you were worried about another European country. Because you had so much conflict, and you had these empires that were weakened and fell because of all of this slave trade, slave wars, your indigenous manufacturing stalled, and instead African societies started relying more and more on European imports, right? So part of that triangle trade was bringing things in from Europe. And so instead of making things in Africa, they became more dependent on importing things from Europe. And of course, now you have a legal framework for institutionalized racism. So you've done all the heavy lifting in the Americas of making a legal system where being black is basically illegal. And being white is a protected status. So now you can take that and just replicate it all over Africa, right? Because here was the idea. We've been moving African bodies to a place with lots of resources to exploit that place. And now that's becoming more difficult because in the 19th century, in the Americas, they were becoming independent, they were rebelling, there was abolition, it was just a mess, right? So what if we kept the African bodies where they are, went into those places, controlled them there, basically ran it like a slave colony, and then took all the resources out of Africa. That's what happens, okay? So all of the chaos, all of the fear, all of the wars, the kind of destruction of large empires, all of the things that came along with the slave trade, with getting all of the supply of slaves that they needed, also created the conditions for subsequent colonial conquest of Africa itself, okay? Africa is very rich in resources, okay? You have a lot of petroleum. You also have a lot of gold, a lot of diamonds, and then a lot of rare minerals that we use in our phones, okay? You've got a little bit of tobacco. You've got a little bit of things like coffee, tea, some cash crops. You've got a couple of your poorest countries doing things like grains and livestock. But for the most part, it's stuff like aluminum, iron. There's some cotton, always bad when you see cotton. Uranium, right? And so Africa is basically, I often call it the Home Depot of the world. Okay, so at this point, if you need something, your country needs something, some kind of raw resource, you usually go to Africa first, see if you can find it. So in 1884, these European powers got together and they said, you know what? We all want to go into Africa. We all want to exploit these people and their resources, but we should do it like civilized gentlemen and not fight each other. So they all got into a room in Berlin, not a single African person present, and carved up Africa among themselves. And this is basically what they got, right? So you have Portuguese, British, French, Belgian, German, Spanish, and Italian countries all carved up through here, right? Like all these are colonized. The only things that are not being run by European powers are Liberia, which at this point is independent, right? They're kind of a protectorate of the United States. And during this time period, France really was kind of looking at Liberia like, what's going on over there? And they would like put ships off the coast of Liberia, and the Americans would come in, their navy would pull into Monrovia and be like, no. Which is just interesting. Like, we have, a lot of times Liberia is called America's stepchild. Like, we have a very weird relationship with them. But we all have always been like, no, you step off Liberia if they're threatened. And then Ethiopia, which really was independent for the most part, except during World War II when the Italians kind of got it for a little while. But for the most part, Ethiopia is not considered colonized at this point in time. Everybody else is. Think about that. Africa is a much larger continent than Europe. And the Europeans came in and just carved it up. It's theirs, right? They're allowed to do that. It's theirs. Very weird. Very weird logic. So how do you do this? How do you control another country? It's not even your country, right? By the way, as I said with slavery, there was lots of resistance. Check out all the resistance to colonialism in Africa, all right? Again, this was not a thing that people just accepted. This was not okay. So one way that you control them is just straight up brute force, right? And we've seen that in other regions. We know that a lot of these countries are capable of it, especially during the early 1900s. They're getting more and more weapons of war after World War I. They've got all kinds of stuff. They've got chemical gas. They've got airplanes they can drop bombs out of, and all of that, this modern warfare. But in places like the Belgian Congo, you would do things like cut people's hands off for very small crimes. Really brutal punishments to just straight up scare people into complying. Okay? That's one way. Another way is divide and conquer. Okay? So the British did this a lot. You go in and there's already a diverse group of people living there in almost every case, right? Because especially on the coasts, you've got a lot of trading. Like I said, you've got that triple heritage. So you've got Christians, Muslims, and people with doing traditional religions. You've got different languages. And so one of the British's favorite thing to do was go in and say, okay, we need to set up a government, but we're only hiring Muslims. Now, the idea was we're only hiring Muslims because literacy is important in Islam, and so the Muslims were more likely to be literate. They could read and write. That is true. However, were they more likely to be literate in English? But basically what they would do is they would create these classes or exploit the classes that already existed by making one privileged and the other not. And so in this way, the privileged class is going to fight the other class to keep their privilege. So the British don't have to do it. And the underclass is going to turn their anger on the upper class because they're in the same country and yet they're treating them like this. And they may deflect attention from the British, right? So divide and conquer. This is classic stuff, okay? Classic stuff. We've seen it a lot lately in the United States, right? The idea that COVID, trying to pit COVID and the BLM movements against each other, right? Watch out for it. It's very common tactic. Another is cultural assimilation and cultural suppression. So the French were really big into cultural assimilation. They wanted people to speak French. They wanted people to live like French people. They very much wanted you to be, they were cultural imperialists, whereas other groups didn't really care so much. Some of the other colonial powers didn't care at all if you were into their culture, right? But the French really were, which was interesting. But you also will get on the other side of that cultural suppression. So your religion is not allowed. Your language is not allowed. Your cultural practices are not allowed. And we saw that a little bit with slavery, right? That is one way to kind of break people, to break social cohesion, is to break down that cultural cohesion, right? Okay. And when all else fails, use that money, baby, okay? Make sure that they are dependent on your money. Make sure that they are in debt to you. And then if they get out of line, call in that debt. All right? So, carrot and stick. But if you have all four of these things going on, it's actually not that difficult to control another country as long as you have lots of money to throw at it. Now, will they necessarily be functional? No, but if you don't care about that, then it's fine. By the way, this is why America's country building, nation building stuff hasn't really been working for us, okay? Iraq, we kind of tried to do all of these things that are built for exploitation, and we were able to kind of control it, but it fell apart and it never really was able to congeal. And part of it is because we were using the wrong toolbox, essentially. So after World War II, you get a movement of independence in Africa, okay? And by now, there's only one major country or one major territory on the mainland of Africa that is not independent, and that is Western Sahara, which is a dependent state of Morocco. Western Sahara is crazy. Usually I spend a whole class on Western Sahara, but I don't have time. There's an excellent Vice documentary called The Sahara's Forgotten War. I highly recommend it. Western Sahara is very interesting. But essentially, by the 1980s, almost everybody in Africa is independent. However, this does not mean that Europe and other powers are no longer dependent on Africa for goods and people, labor, cheap labor. They've just created a different and frankly cheaper for them way of controlling these countries. And it's called structural adjustment, okay? And it's a program through the World Bank where these countries, we talked about it before in the context of the Middle East. It's happening all around the world. These countries need some money, okay? They're poor, they need some money, either to put in highways, to try to boost manufacturing, to pay off debts, to whatever, right? Countries need money, and these economies, a lot of them are very weak. And so to invest in that economy, they need money. So they go to the World Bank, and they say, we'd like some money to help develop our country, because it's the World Bank, it's supposed to be a development fund. So they say, all right, we'll give you money, but we have some conditions. And those conditions are what we talk about when we say structural adjustment. So one is free trade, which means basically you need to eliminate all barriers to foreign business and extraction. So if I am Angola and I undergo structural adjustment, I have to get rid of all tariffs, all kind of import substitution policies. I have to let the United States and Europe come in and start all the businesses they want, start mines. I can't really tax them very much on what they can take pretty much all they want out of my country. However, they don't drop their tariffs on my stuff, okay? So Angola's stuff is still subject to tariffs in the United States and Great Britain, but the United States and Great Britain don't have to pay tariffs to Angola. Do you see already the problem here? Structural adjustment also usually requires that you destroy your government social safety net. And by this, I mean everything. Pensions, unemployment, disability payments, healthcare of all kinds. There is basically no universal healthcare at all, okay? Not Medicare, not Medicaid. Y'all, there are a lot of parts of Africa where if you go to the emergency room, you have to have the money up front. They won't treat you if you don't have the money up front. There are also places where you don't just have to have the money, you have to have all the supplies, including the water. You have to bring jugs of clean water with you so that they'll actually do the surgery or whatever. When people talk about the United States having the world's worst health care, what they're saying is that the United States has bad health care for how rich they are. The United States does not have the world's worst health care. You can go to an emergency room and get treated. That's not the case in the entire world. And it's important that we understand that. And in fact, in a lot of places in the world, they had public schools and no longer do because of structural adjustment. There are, Central America, there are parents that pay half of their salary so that their kid can go to elementary school. Like, we don't consider that an okay option, but in a lot of the world, because of structural adjustment forced by the World Bank, backed by the United States of America, countries have been forced to give up their public education systems. Remove all environmental protections. So this goes along with basically the first one that says not only do foreign interests get to come in and drill and pump and mine and cut down trees, but they can do it as filthy as they want, okay? They don't have to follow any kind of EPA protocols. Fire most of your government employees. Small government, right? Small government, it's basically the most extreme version of neoliberalism that we talked about last week. This idea that the free market, that you don't have to pay for other people's anything, all of this. This is the extreme version of it. We don't have this in the United States to this level. However, we've been moving towards it in the past couple of decades. And Africa is an important example of why you don't want to swing too far away from maybe a social welfare state of some kind, okay? Okay. So when we talk about Africa, we're talking about the resource curse squared. Okay, we talked about the resource curse in the Middle East, but Africa is just like off the rails. Okay, so this is an image of Nigeria, where there's a lot of petroleum oil drilling kind of happening, and it's just trashed, right? So you have these weak economies because they're based on one or two natural resources that are hooked into the world market. So if the market goes up or down, the whole economy is up or down, like we talked about with Russia. There hasn't been really any diversification of the economy. Because the resources are being taken out of Africa before they're refined, there isn't manufacturing or refining going on in a lot of cases. It's, it's not great. Poor working conditions, because of course one of those things with structural adjustment is you get rid of kind of OSHA rules, safety inspections, all of that sort of thing. So you can make people work crazy hours, pay them very little, don't worry about their health at all. If you watch anything about the diamond mines in South Africa that are maybe like 2 miles deep or whatever, it's super hot down there because they're like near the hot part of the earth, and it's crazy. It's crazy. You have import dependence. Remember how we said that African manufacturing was destroyed during the slaving years, and you had a dependence on European imports growing? That exists to this day, okay? Ali Masri, who is kind of the leading philosophical voice on modern Africa, calls Africa the continent that eats what it does not produce and produces what it does not eat. So it's quite similar to what we were talking about in the Caribbean, where most of their production is set up for cash crops, which you don't eat, you sell, and then they're importing a lot more food than they produce. And in some cases, it's just a lot more fashionable to eat imported food. And so my African friends will tell me stories of, yeah, you want to eat the can of European tomatoes instead of the fresh tomato that your neighbor grew. That's just got more cachet. Tons of foreign influence all the time. Foreign money flying all over the place. Foreign people coming in and doing all kinds of expedition. A lot of government corruption, again, because you have all of this money and this one resource. And so you see a lot of unstable governments in Africa for a lot of reasons. But part of it is you just have a corrupt government after corrupt government after corrupt government. Not everywhere, but a lot of places. And of course, a lot of environmental degradation, like we said here, right? And so Africa is one of these countries struggling with a lot of high corruption perception index. And you don't want high corruption perception, even if you are super corrupt, because that means that people don't believe in the system anymore, and people don't justify the system anymore. They don't follow the rules anymore. So you want your corruption low. You also want your perception of corruption low. So this is my all-time favorite story that really exemplifies how Europe and European powers are still hyper-dependent on Africa. And this is kind of how neocolonialism works. So I'm sure you're aware that a year or two ago, Notre Dame, the cathedral in France, burned down. Okay, Notre Dame, important symbol of France, really amazing building, and they're trying to figure out how to rebuild it. Well, the roof supports for Notre Dame are these huge logs, these huge timbers that originally were, harvested in France. At this point, France does not have enough old-growth forests to supply enough timber to rebuild Notre Dame. Okay, France can't do it with French timber. They can't. So they have to look for another place to find wood. So the first thing they do is they say, Africa, because Africa is the Home Depot of the world. So they go to the world's lumber yard, which is Africa, and they say, hey, what do you guys have? And there's this company in Ghana that says, well, okay, we have an excellent solution for you, right? They say, so first of all, Notre Dame wasn't like this, but a lot of the cathedrals in Europe used building material called bogwood. So these were trees that were sunk into a bog, they just naturally, and they had started to petrify, right? Like petrified wood, but they'd only started it. So they were harder than normal wood, but they were still wood. And so this bogwood isn't just really strong, it's also a little bit less flammable. So these people in Ghana said, well, we've got basically a supply of bogwood. In the 70s, we built a dam and created Lake Volta in Ghana. And when that happened, we flooded a huge forest, okay? And all of this wood has been sitting under there becoming bogwood. So our company harvests the wood underwater and then brings it up, and then, you know, we can send it all up to France and you can rebuild the cathedral. And won't it be so good because you haven't cut down a live forest? France is like, cool, this is great, this sounds great. So then I looked into it because it sounded odd. And it turns out that these sunken trees in Lake Volta are actually the core of an ecosystem that is a fishery ecosystem. The fish that live in these sunken trees are the livelihood for 700,000 families. 700,000 families. So that's millions of people. So if you cut these trees down to rebuild this cathedral in France, you are introducing economic and food insecurity to millions of Africans. But it sure does look like that's what they're going to do. And so these are the kinds of decisions that are still being made that are favoring the whims and fancies of Europeans over the lives of Africans. Okay? It's happening to this day, every day. So a lot of the structural adjustment loans actually were forgiven or paid off in the last decade. You had a couple of really important leaders who came in and really worked with the World Bank to try to relieve or reduce those loans. Probably the biggest success story was actually Liberia. But that doesn't mean that these countries aren't still in need of money. And so they've changed direction, okay? Now you've got new players in Africa that weren't big players before. China, USA, Japan, and Russia. Okay? So while the European powers are still in Africa, now you've got these new kids on the block. China especially, all right? In the last 10 years, China has become a serious force for international development. And so that is one weapon of a Cold War, is international development money. We talked about that with the USSR and the United States in the mid-century. And it looks like China and the United States are in one of these foreign aid wars right now. And in the case of Angola, the government just straight up gave China oil in exchange for major infrastructure construction, okay? So one of the things that's different here is that China isn't coming in necessarily with a check. China's coming in and saying, what do you need? We'll build it for you in a lot of cases, okay? Which is a little bit more attractive. It seems like maybe they care about the country a little bit more. But also, they've said, well, we're trying to wean you off of international dependence, but they don't actually do those projects, okay? So it really does look like it's just a different version of the same thing. And here's what it looks like, right? Over the 21st century, loans to China, or loans from China to Africa have gone way up. And the last 5 years, way, way up, okay? So in 2016, it was $30 billion. In 2017, it was more than twice that, and I don't even know what the most recent is. But China's pouring a lot of money into Africa, okay? And Africa is buying a lot from China. In fact, Africa is buying a lot more from China than China is importing from Africa. And so Africa has also become a really important market for Chinese goods. Okay? So, yeah, India, another group you may not expect to have a whole lot of money in with Africa. India's all up in there. And then it's the US, Germany, UK, and then Russia's kind of at the end. But Russia wasn't really in Africa at all until recently. So colonialism is one of these things that seeps into kind of everything. And in Africa, it is so hard to emphasize how critical this colonial period was for their development and continues to be. Transportation networks in Africa are horrible, and a huge part of it is because of this colonial legacy and then structural adjustment. Only 43% of the roads in Africa are paved, and a third of those are in South Africa. South Africa, of course, is famous for being the only African country that was heavily colonized by a lot of European people. You have European descendant people all over Africa, but South Africa is kind of where they were in large numbers. And so, of course, South Africa often looks a lot more like the United States or Europe compared to other parts of Africa. And so you just have a terrible road network. You don't have a lot of bridges. You got a lot of trolleys. And the biggest thing here, though, is that if you are setting up a transportation network because you are a colonizer and your goal is to extract as much resources from the interior of your colony, put them on a boat, send them across the ocean, then the way you build your transportation network is going to reflect that. It looks like this. This is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, okay? It looks like you have highways or roads or railroads that branch out from your main port to wherever your mines are or plantations or whatever, and that's the only place they go. It goes from plantation to the port and back, okay? And this happens all over Africa. In every single colony, their transportation network looks like this, okay? So here's South Africa, a very similar thing. South Africa is actually more well-developed than some others. They have more than one big city. But still, it's basically to the interior, to the ocean. And that's it. So what that means is you don't have ring roads. You don't have these interconnected. If you look at a map of the United States highway system, it doesn't look like this, right? It's like a grid. It's like, how do you interconnect everybody? That wasn't the idea when they were building these. They didn't care if the people were connected. They only wanted the resources. So look at the railroad map, right? You look at each country, there's a railroad that goes from the ocean to the interior, and that's it. They don't connect with each other. And because it was all of these different powers doing this, they aren't even the same gauge. They aren't even the same kind of railroad, so you couldn't connect a lot of these if you wanted to. So this leads to a lot of problems for Africa. Extremely expensive commerce. If you're trying to move something around countries, it's very difficult to do because you don't have a transcontinental railroad. You don't have things like that. You have very isolated countries, so you don't it's hard to build relationships with your neighbors when it's hard to even get over to see your neighbors, right? Poor access to health care. Check out Cairo here. It is not the easiest thing to catch a cab and get to the doctor, or heaven forbid, get an ambulance through there, okay? There have been many cases recently in West Africa where there were fires, and if it wasn't for the traffic, people's lives would have been saved, but instead they died because the firefighters and ambulances couldn't get to them, okay? Huge traffic accident fatality rate in a lot of Africa. Ferry accidents, okay? You'll hear about those pretty regularly because there's no bridges, so people are on these ferries. The ferries are often not regulated, and yeah, people drown in the rivers. And it's just a logistical challenge for like anything. Resource allocation. Where do you put clinics? How do you evacuate people out of danger? All of it. Here's another picture. It's just a big mess. It's a big mess. And here's our traffic accident deaths, right? So, Middle East, not doing great either. Yeah, I don't know. But, right. So one of the big projects, one of the big things that's going on currently is the Trans-African Corridors, which is basically putting a ring road around the entire continent of Africa. It's a huge undertaking. Currently, only about half of it is paved. And it is a project of the African Union and African Development Bank. But my friends, where do you think the African Development Bank is getting their money? Well, bam, from China. See, China is currently in a project where they are building the Belt and Road Initiative, okay? Basically, the Belt and Road Initiative is the modern version of that old world trade map that I keep showing you, where it's the Silk Roads, and then it's like the trade routes around Southeast Asia, and then it's trans-Saharan. China is building highways and ports for all of that, okay? It's actually a really amazing project. And one of the big places that they're focusing on is Africa, because Africa has such a problem with this. I don't know, but it's kind of exciting that one day you could go road trip Africa, but right now you kind of can't. So vulnerabilities aren't additive. They are multiplicative, okay? So when you have multiple vulnerabilities, they get worse and worse and worse faster. It's an exponential curve, okay? And in medical geography, probably the number one rule is that poverty contributes to poor health and poor health contributes to poverty, right? So like I've said, it's been very frustrating for me to see people trying to separate health and the economy as though they are enemies of each other, when really they go together. They are partners, all right? Africa is famous for being very poor, and I don't want to contribute to an idea that Africa is poor and sick, Africa is poor and sick, but in some ways Africa is poor and sick, and we need to talk about why. Because if the conversation just stops at Africa is poor and sick, people have a tendency to go, well, they just need to try harder. And that's not really what's going on in Africa, okay? So colonialism is huge. You had all the money and the resources directed away from Africa, right? That money was not being used to invest in the infrastructure, even less than in the Americas, because outside of South Africa, you didn't have a big colonialism push. So why would you be trying to improve the cities if it's just black people living there, right? Like, why would you do that? So it is extraordinary exploitative in a way that you didn't even really see in Haiti, okay? Then, as they moved into structural adjustment and debt, this kind of new realm of paying off debt and not being able to expand health services or school services, how on earth are you going to have a modern economy when it costs a lot of money to educate the kids, right? It doesn't make any sense. So they get stuck in this pattern, okay? you have these weak governments, and so because you have a lot of weak governments, corrupt governments, they aren't standing up and doing things like trying to get debt dissolved and trying to push for changes for their people. Instead, a lot of times they're trying to enrich themselves before their government falls and the next one comes in. Weak economies, right? There aren't a lot of sectors to join. You've got a lot of black market economies, just people trying to hustle however they can. Poor health. People who are sick can't work. So if you have a population that is in bad health, your economy is going to suffer. Globally, poverty is decreasing. However, in Africa continues to increase. So when we talk about income inequality and wealth inequality, you need to think about different scales, because there's definitely income inequality at a small scale. So like within my group of friends, within my neighborhood, within Denton County, within Texas, within the United States, and then within the world, okay? And within the world, wealth inequality is deepening, and Africa is the loser, okay? And so when we're talking about Africa, the rules for poverty are extremely different than they are in the United States, right? You're not going to find a lot of people in the United States. There are some. But you're not going to find a lot in the United States living on less than $1.90 a day. And that is in no way the definition of poverty in the United States of America. Right? That would be like $700 a year. The definition of poverty in the United States is somewhere more like $15,000 a year. So, even with this very, 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 very restrictive definition of poverty, a lot of people in Africa are living under $1.90 a day. And by the way, that's purchasing power parity. So what that means is what you can buy for $1.90 a day is what they can buy. So it's not like, oh, $1.90, that's your rent. No. If $1.90 a day here can buy you a small cheeseburger and a small fry at McDonald's, maybe, almost, then that's what it can buy you there too. That's what purchasing power parity means. So this is extreme poverty. 77% of the Democratic Republic of the Congo lives in extreme poverty. Over 50% of Nigerians, 78% of people in Madagascar, but even almost 20% of people in South Africa live on less than $1.90 a day. So it's just an extreme amount of poverty, you guys. Like, I mean, nearly hopeless, all right? And poverty itself then drives all kinds of things. Youth dissatisfaction. So when you have unhappy youth population, you're more likely to have an unstable government because they are agitators in like a good way, but still. Large informal markets, right? Black markets, low entrepreneurship. People aren't starting businesses. How can you? You don't have any money. You have $1.90. Poor access to healthcare. Like I said, it is a pay-to-play system, and you have $2 to your name. So who are you going to pay? Poor nutrition, because you're eating whatever you can afford. Generally, that's going to be not nutritious stuff, just like here, okay? You get a lot of rural to urban migration. So a lot of people moving all over the place to find opportunity, okay? So you get a lot of people moving into the cities for jobs. You also get a lot of people moving to mines and stuff like that. You get the growth of urban slums. We believe that by the year 2050, half the world's population is going to live in urban slums. This is very, very bad. And all of these things are contributing to the spread of HIV. Okay? So, before I get into the nitty-gritty of HIV, let's talk about demographics and disease. So this is what's called, this chart here is called the demographic transition. It's one of the most important things that I talk about in health geography. And basically what's going on here is this is generally what happens in almost every population on Earth as they settle and develop. So in stage 1, you have a high birth rate and a high death rate. This is generally what we talk about when I said when you first settle into a society, things go bad, right? It's like you have a low life expectancy, you're having bunches of babies, but it's about even, and so your population remains low. In stage 2, you start to bring down the death rate, okay? And the death rate decreases because of technological innovations, because of sanitation and drugs and that sort of thing. But the birth rate remains high. So here's something that's critical for you to understand. The death rate drops because of technological innovation. The birth rate drops because of social change, okay? Social change takes longer than technological change. So if you need to change people's thoughts in order to get a result, it's going to be a much harder battle than technological, okay? So for a long time, for a while, during stage 2 and stage 3, birth rates are quite a bit higher than death rates. That means that you have an increasing population. Now, a lot of times people, especially we'll call them neo-Malthusians, will tell you we have an overpopulation crisis, and they'll only show you stage 1 and stage 2 graph, and then they'll cut the rest of it off. Oh, the population's going to go and increase forever, and then we're not going to be able to have enough food, and that's not how it works, okay? Because in stage 3, birth rates start to drop, and by stage 4, birth rates and death rates are even again, and your population is basically flat. A larger population, but it's basically flat. Okay? And what drops the birth rate more than anything? Educating women. All right? When women don't have to have children for their social status or for retirement, then you don't have as many babies because it's not fun or easy having babies. So, yeah. All right? So by stage 4, which is where we were 6 months ago in the United States, basically you've got an even or maybe even decreasing population because you have a low death rate and a low birth rate. Now, all of this is brought to us by the epidemiologic transition, okay, which is the transition from primarily infectious diseases, okay, like smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza, to degenerative diseases like cancer, heart disease, diabetes. So in the epidemiologic transition, you start off with infectious and parasitic diseases, you move through a stage of receding pandemics into degenerative and man-made diseases. But then there's this stage 5. And this stage 5, well, first of all, if you have a country that is dealing with both infectious and degenerative diseases at the same time, it's called the double burden of disease, okay? The double burden of disease. Africa is famous for double burden of disease. They're dealing with both at the same time. United States, currently, with COVID, are now in double burden of disease territory, where we weren't before. So previously, when I've taught this, we get to stage 5, which is potential resurgence of infectious diseases due to globalization. I don't think there is any argument anymore that we are in stage 5. And we don't really know what exactly that's going to do to our population. We do know that with COVID, we're expecting a huge drop in birth rates all around the world. Okay, it's going to change our demographics. It's terrifying and exciting. So, double burden of disease. One of the things that seems to blow people's minds is when I show them this chart and tell them that Africa and African countries are simultaneously dealing with undernutrition, malnutrition, and obesity. But they are, okay? You can see Sierra Leone, it's wild. It's like 12% of people have undernutrition and 16% of people are overweight or obese. And so you have a lot of things happening at once. Why is obesity a problem in Africa? Well, it's income inequality. Your richer people, it's very classy to constantly be eating American style, which is bad for you, right? Like, I love American style eating, and it's not good for me at all. On the other hand, you've got the very poor people living on less than $1.90 a day who are unable to get anything nutritious, right? And so you've got this bifurcation very, very, very clear in the health data. And in fact, we expect sub-Saharan Africa to be the fastest growing region for diabetes in the next, well, I guess we're already halfway through this period, but by 2030, diabetes is growing fastest there because they're going through this transition currently. So, Africa has to deal with these degenerative diseases, obesity, diabetes, heart disease. These are relatively new. They also have this burden of infectious disease. We've talked about malaria, which they still have to deal with, and a whole bunch of other diseases. But the one emerging pandemic that really is critical to understand from the last 30, 40 years is HIV. So HIV, or human immunodeficiency virus, okay, is it's a terrible disease that destroys your immune system, okay? It's an autoimmune disease. And basically, eventually what it does is it leaves you open to dying of pretty much any kind of infection. The number one way that cause of death, people with HIV, is tuberculosis. You get tuberculosis and it kills you. But, you know, when you have late stage HIV, what used to be called AIDS, an ear infection can kill you. I mean, you are very vulnerable. And so we have HIV in our community as well. You need to protect yourself from it. So HIV can be transmitted through sexual contact, any gender or sex to any gender or sex. So gay, straight, pan, whatever. Sharing needles. Don't share needles with people. Like, I don't think you should be doing needle drugs generally, my friends. But if you are, invest in your own needles. If you're sitting there and you're going, well, I could spend this money on a needle or a little bit more heroin, baby, you need some help, because no, don't share needles. Or you can also transmit it mother to baby during breastfeeding or pregnancy. It's called vertical transmission. That doesn't happen very often in the United States anymore because if you get a pregnant woman antiretrovirals, so there's a medication that will drop your viral load, she can have a baby with no HIV, okay? And in the United States, we have a lot of programs to do that. In Africa, not so much. So that is still something that happens in Africa. It used to be that people used to get it from blood transfusions, but not anymore. All blood is screened for HIV now. So that's not a problem anymore. HIV not transmitted through the air, through the water, by saliva, sweat, tears, little kisses. Mwah, mwah. Insects, you can't get it from a mosquito. You can't get it from sharing food, okay? Basically, you know, sex or needles. And HIV originates in Congo, Central Africa, in the early 20s, but because partially of this crazy transportation system, right, that they have that doesn't connect with other countries, that's just kind of this to Kinshasa and into the interior, HIV for like 40 years or 40 years just kind of bounces around within Congo without really being identified what it is, because HIV is so difficult to identify. You may not have symptoms for 10 years before you have symptoms and go to the doctor and they're like, something's wrong. That's why you need to be tested regularly, okay? So someone can spread it for 10 years and not know that they're spreading it. And that is the biggest danger with HIV. So it bounces around. It doesn't really get out of this region until the 50s. We think some sailors got it and started spreading it around, and that's basically how the scene was set for the 80s when things started to blow up, okay? And here's how it went in Africa. So from 1988 into 2003 there, HIV basically spread through sub-Saharan Africa, found its favorite spot in southern Africa. All right. Southern Africa has been the hardest hit by HIV by far of any part of the world. There are parts of southern Africa where 1 in 4 adults has HIV. You have major orphan problems. One thing I want to be very clear about is that not all African countries are HIV hotspots. People tend to talk about Africa like it's a country, like it's a unified it's a very huge continent. So there are parts of Africa that have lower HIV rates than the United States, okay? Including Somalia, Senegal, Madagascar, Sudan, Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt, okay? And then HIV rates are rising in Russia. That's why I have Russia on here. You have to forgive me. I cannibalized all of my old slides for the summer session, and so there are things that I didn't get to. But still, lower than Russia, higher than the United States, but lower than Russia's HIV rates. And that's Ethiopia, Burundi, Benin, Mali, Cabo Verde, Burkina Faso, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the home of HIV. And the poorest country in Africa. Eritrea, Mauritania, and Niger. So there are plenty of places in Africa where HIV isn't really a big problem. One of the reasons I emphasize this is because one of the things that the health departments in Africa are telling us is we've got like the Gates Foundation and other health foundations coming in to Ethiopia or Somalia and saying, oh, well, we're here to fight AIDS. And we're telling them that's not our problem. Our problem isn't HIV. Our problem is malaria, or our problem is tsetse fly, or our problem is malnutrition, or our problem is heart disease. But they're convinced and they have the money for HIV. And so these public health departments have to basically waste their time on these foreign donors who want to help HIV, but they're in the wrong country. And so they can't actually deal with their own health problems. And so then it keeps making things worse. Okay? So that's, again, that external influence, even with good intentions, can be a huge problem. So what we find is that really what spurs HIV spread more than anything is rapid urbanization in Africa, specifically in South Africa. So one of the things you see here is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Even though it was the home of HIV, you saw it didn't have a super high rate of HIV. They don't have a super high rate of urbanization. But these other places often do. So what's going on is, remember when I said people are moving to the cities for economic opportunity? Well, the classic thing is this. You've got a husband and wife in a village, in a rural village. He goes to the urban area to make money for a little while. She stays back. They're both super poor. He's in the city and he starts making some money and he's got some cash. Okay? Now, he's lonely because he's away from his family, and in a lot of cases, he's going to get a girlfriend or hire a hooker and spread the disease that way. That's one way. Now, wife back at home, something that's very common is picking up a boyfriend or two. Sometimes they're truckers who come through. So you have this like transactional sex relationship, but it's not the same as kind of what we're used to with like streetwalkers. But this has become more and more common as poverty has become entrenched and families are apart from each other for long periods of time because of all of this internal migration. And so all of these sexual relationships, even if it's only, 2 or 3 outside of the relationship, are opportunities for HIV to spread. If you're in an area where 1 in 4 people already have HIV, you are being very, you're taking a lot of risk. And then you've got another problem where, okay, so you've got a lot of women who are in sex work because the economy is so bad that you've got to do something. It's the oldest profession. And they'll pay you $1 with a condom and $10 with no condom. So how do you do that math? And for a lot of women, it's like, well, I'll take that one chance and then not have to sleep with 10 people. Because, of course, each John is an opportunity to get beat, to get abused, even worse, right? So a lot of people find themselves in impossible situations, and in that world, HIV has a lot of opportunities to spread. And so one version of this is in Malawi, around the lakes, where you have women who work the fish markets, who have been fish saleswomen for a very long time. And you started to have this thing where the fishermen would bring in their fish and they would basically ask women for sex instead of money for the fish. So you were prostituting yourself to get the fish to sell at the market, which sounds like a miserable life, but you do what you need to do to support yourself. And so that was creating a lot of HIV spread in these communities. And the number one way that they have found to stop that is to give women their own boats. And this lady, with her boat, actually has written "No Sex for Fish" on the side of it, because the "No Sex for Fish" campaign has been going on for about 10 years. And of course, not only does that stop HIV, but it helps people. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being sexually liberated. But for the most part, prostitution is not a fun job to have. And so you're helping people not just keep out of HIV, but have more self-control, right? Have control over their world and their bodies and all of that. And so this is why we can't separate economics and health. We have to imagine interventions into health that improve the economic situation of people. They're one and the same. They're completely tied together. So your take-home message from this lecture is this. Africa has suffered because they have become both the laboratory and the Home Depot for the rest of the world. We test our antiretroviral drugs in Africa because in the United States you are not allowed to use a placebo, because we know that antiretrovirals work. So you use the old one and the new one and you compare them. In Africa, you don't have to do that. You could just give pregnant women placebos knowing that that means that their babies will have HIV. We do that all the time. The whole world does that. We use African bodies to keep ourselves safe. And it's ridiculous. We use them as the Home Depot. We take everything out of there that we need. We take things for our phones. We take things for our computers. We take things for our batteries. And we never really think about what that does to these communities. The good news is that the African Union, so we talked about the European Union, there is an African Union. The African Union has been building steam, and they are hoping to change this. They're hoping to change the way the world sees Africa. They're hoping to change the way the world exploits Africa. They want to take better care of their people. And one of the things that's most interesting about the African Union lately is that they're doing a lot to try to embrace the African diaspora around the world. So if you are a black person, it might be interesting to just go out on the African Union. I mean, if you're not black, it's interesting too, but to go out on the African Union's website and look at what they are talking about with the diaspora, because they're talking about you. They want you to feel included. So those things that I talked about last lecture, where black people's culture in the United States and around the world, in a lot of cases, has been stripped from them, the African Union is trying to do something about that. So, man, that's a really fast and dirty way of talking about Africa, but it gives you something. It gives you something to contextualize this in, and hopefully Africa's a little bit less of a mystery. And man, do I wish and hope I get to teach the Sub-Saharan Africa class one day. We'll do this for all semester. Okay, I'll see you back here for COVID.